So could we start by, can you state your name, age, and hometown?
Yeah. My name is Ann Yuki Watanabe. I'm 27 years old, and my hometown, I I don't really feel like I have a hometown because I moved around growing up. I lived in like a bunch of places like 7 years at a time, but I was born in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and then I lived in Ottawa for 3 years, then New Jersey for 7 years, and then I went to college in Western Mass.
Okay. And what, if you don't mind me asking, what was the reason for moving around?
It was like, I think a combination, like my dad went to grad school in Champaign-Urbana, and then when he finished school, I guess it was mostly like employment and school related for my parents, yeah.
And do you have any siblings?
I have one brother. Actually, no, I have two siblings. I have a brother who's 2 years older than me, who I grew up with, and then I have a half-sister who I've never met. She was adopted in a closed adoption, so I'm planning to look for her, but she won't be able to, like, look for us until she's 18, so I feel like I can't really do anything about it right now.
Okay. And so Champaign, Ottawa, New Jersey, Western Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Where of those places do you identify any one as home more than the other? Or?
No, I don't really. I have a hard time with that. Like, I have a hard time with the concept of home. And I think, like, it is partly about having this sort of geographically, like, moved around throughout my childhood. But I think it's also partly about this, like, pattern of leaving that I feel like my parents were kind of in. Like, they both moved pretty far away from their families of origin. They were the only people in their families of origin to, like, leave sort of their hometowns. And so, yeah, I feel like I've internalized something similar about not quite feeling, like, settled anywhere.
And so where were your parents from?
So my mom is from Tokyo. She was born and raised in Japan, and she lived there until I think her late 20s or early 30s. And my dad is from Ottawa. I think he grew up between, like, Toronto and Ottawa. I'm not sure. I think it was mostly in Ottawa. But his whole family is Japanese Canadian, and they all live in either, like, Toronto or Ottawa.
Okay. Then can you talk a little bit about your family's connection to the history of the incarceration during World War II in Canada, and where your grandparents were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't feel like I know a whole lot because I haven't really gotten to talk to them about it a lot, and my family's, which partly has to do with sort of my relationship with my family in general, but my dad's family was all incarcerated in Canada during World War II. So they originally were from the west coast of Canada, like I think in like Vancouver, and they were incarcerated in the Tashmi and Lillooet camps. I don't really know anything about those camps. I tried to do an oral history interview with my grandfather, my dad's father, and then also with my Auntie Fumi, who's my grandmother's sister. But yeah, I feel like, it was really hard to kind of get any stories, and I feel like I really kind of got the summer camp version of the story where it was sort of like, yeah, it was hard, but we worked hard and it was fine.
Totally. So growing up, did you have your grandparents alive, and did you have a relationship with them?
Yeah, my grandfather is still alive, but I would say, my relationship with my dad's family has always felt kind of fraught, because, I I think my parents were both sort of like the black sheeps of their family, and my, my dad kind of like moved far away, and so we wouldn't see them that often, like maybe like once a year at the most. But there was always a lot of tension between like there was like tension about like the Nikkei-ness of like my family, where like my mom had this narrative that like they didn't like her because she was too Japanese. And but she was also like very like judgmental of them as like Nikkei, like Japanese Canadians, where she felt like they weren't like truly Japanese. And and there were like tensions for other reasons. So whenever we went there to visit, like I was always kind of being given this narrative, like we should be careful here because they don't really like us. And so I think I just never really felt that close to my dad's family because I didn't, I felt this sense of like distrust when I was there. But yeah, I mean, I think like, this like, yeah, I mean, I grew up knowing, I don't remember like how exactly I learned it, but there was like openness about the fact that like, like Japanese incarceration during World War II had happened. And I later found out, I didn't know this at the time growing up, but I later found out that my grandfather was involved in some of like the reparations work, like the organizing around it. And he was very like, like he's Nisei, and like he speaks Japanese fluently, and like he like did taiko drumming and stuff, and so he didn't, I think he tried to like pass on sort of like he just what am I saying, just like he clearly like felt that the incarceration was an injustice, and he was like open around that, and he like did work around that, and he did work to like personally connect with his Japanese heritage and for his children to have some of that too. So yeah, that's definitely something I saw, but it does feel like there is, like there's this way in which like it impacted my family that like nobody really wanted to talk about that. Like I think, I think part of my parents both leaving their families of origin like had something to do with like family trauma, although it's not really clear to me like what exactly. But my dad dealt with like a lot of addiction later in his life. Like my dad died in 2012, but in like the 2012. Yeah, I would say in like the 5 or 6 years before he died, like he dealt with like a ton of addiction to some like pretty hard drugs. Like he was addicted to like crack and heroin. He kind of went through this like midlife crisis, and he was like in and out of jail, and he was in and out of rehab briefly, and then he went back to Canada, and he actually like got completely clean and like had this like major recovery, but then he like died of a heart attack a couple years later. So I don't know, I'm just like, and especially like growing up too, like there was a lot of trauma in my nuclear family, and like stuff that my parents were struggling with and that my dad in particular was struggling with. And so I kind of feel like you don't like do that unless you're like dealing with some like demons, but he just, and I just like, so I noticed all of the sort of like gaps in my family's ability to like, there's just kind of a like, we don't really know where that came from, like we don't really know, or like just like not talking about like the incarceration and how it's impacted our family, but like I believe that it has, but I don't quite like know in what way.
And does your dad have siblings?
Yeah, he has 4 siblings. He has 1 older sister and 3 younger brothers.
And excuse me. How, in what you know about them, like, do you think that have you ever talked about the incarceration with them, or like outside of your nuclear family? Yeah,
I have. They're like they're more open about it than my grandfather. So, you know, they've kind of told me that like I know my grandfather had a younger brother who died while they were in the camps. Like there was like some situation where he was supposed to be watching his younger brother, and they were like out somewhere. I don't remember exactly what the circumstance was, but like he had been charged with watching him, and then somehow like his brother died. Like he like fell in a river or something like he drowned, I think. And so my grandfather felt like super responsible for that, and somehow like that particular circumstance happening was like connected to the whole like experience of being incarcerated. And so yeah, like my uncles have, you know, kind of said that they think my grandfather has a lot of like, you know, just like anger and like like bitterness about the experience, but he doesn't, but it's just like he doesn't talk about it in that way. Like yeah, like it's just hard, but yeah, like they think that that's part of kind of what has like been like hard in our family, is that he does have all this like stuff that is bottled up or that he's been holding in, but like, you know, it's just like it's just there.
And what about your grandmother's side and her story? Has there been?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I really I really feel like I didn't know my grandmother at all. Yeah, like I was never close with her, and like she really didn't, like she didn't have a very vocal presence. Like I don't remember ever having a conversation with her. You know, like she was just sort of there. And then it was weird because when I asked my uncle about that, or like one of my uncles, he was just like, yeah, I don't remember ever having a conversation with her either. And I was like, well, that was your mom. So there's kind of, and like, yeah, her relationship with my grandfather was kind of like deferential in this way that, I don't know, like, yeah, I just feel like I didn't really get to see her that much, like, as a person. I feel like I knew her sisters more than I knew her, which, like, her older sister, Auntie Fumi, who's, like, the oldest. My grandmother had 4 sisters, and Auntie Fumi was the oldest, and she was the youngest. And Auntie Fumi is kind of, like, the matriarch of the family, and, like, you know, like lots of, like, multiple, like, I think my dad and some of my uncles had, like, lived in her basement while they were, like, in school, or, like, you know, she just kind of, like, took care of everybody. Like, she never got married or had her own family. She, like, took care of her parents, like, when they became elderly. And especially my great-grandmother, like, they lived together for a long time until my great-grandmother died. And yeah, like, Auntie Fumi has always sort of asserted that, like, she, like, did what she wanted, and, you know, she always wanted to take care of her parents and kind of, like, do her duty as, like, the oldest. But, yeah, like, I also tried to ask her about the incarceration a little bit, and, you know, she's very, like, she's a really, like, practical sort of person, and she doesn't, you know, I know she, like, she taught elementary school during the camps, so she was like, I think, like, a teenager. I think she was like 16 or so, but she was one of, like, the elementary school teachers because they just didn't have enough people to, like, teach school. So then she later became a teacher, like, after the war, and yeah, and I knew, like, they grew, like, you know, gardens and stuff for food. And so...
And this is what you've learned from conversations with her directly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, she's told me that. Yeah, I don't... But yeah, she doesn't really talk about how she felt about it. And yeah, I mean, I know they were, I guess they were resettled to, like, the Toronto and Ottawa area, which are, like, in the eastern sort of side of Canada. So similar to, like, what happened in the U.S. And other people, like, my dad's cousin has talked to me about how, she really, like, feels like Japanese Canadian communities got, like, broken up after the war, and how she feels like people were afraid to, like, openly, like, identify too much as a community, and afraid of being targeted in the same way again. But yeah, I guess it all feels really piecemeal. Like, I don't feel like I've really had super coherent conversations with anyone in my family. It's just like little bits and pieces here and there.
What are some other like stories, like family stories, or that's been similar to my experience too, is it's like just a blurb. I feel like I'm just like collecting little pieces of my own family's experiences, and it sounds like it's something similar. So if there are more stories, what might some of those be, or memories?
Yeah, I feel like that might be the extent of them. I really can't think of that many more. I mean, I know we had, like, like Farewell to Manzanar, and that was a book that, like, my grandparents had in their house. So I think I probably read that at some point. But yeah, I feel like I didn't really get it as, like, a significant thing when I was growing up, because of how it was kind of treated as a very, like, as, like, sort of a footnote, in my family. Like, it was, right, the way that it was piecemeal, it was sort of just like this, like, oh, side note, we were incarcerated during World War II. So I don't think I really understood that it was significant. And it was only later in life, after I became an adult, that I became a lot more interested in the history. Like, even everything that I do know, it's mostly stuff I've learned after, like, in my early 20s. When I was just like, oh, whoa, I've never actually heard this stuff from my family, so I went and kind of tried to go digging for it a little bit. But that was challenging too, because there was, like, other stuff that had happened in my family, so, like, I was kind of, like, a little bit estranged from them for a couple of years. So I just didn't really have the relationships to be able to really get more of the story in the way that I wanted.
And so you said you were kind of delving into it in your early 20s. Was that when you were in college?
Yeah, when I was in college, I I was in a class that I had to write a research paper for, and I ended up writing it on, like, the intergenerational effects of Japanese internment, which was not necessarily something I was, like, out there looking for, but it was like I was trying to, like, look at how, I was interested in sort of, like, Asian American and Japanese American, like, activism in, like, the 70s and 80s, and through that I, like, stumbled across some books that talked about, like, the intergenerational stuff, and I was really surprised because I had never read about that or, like, thought about it before. But I definitely recognized a lot of myself and my family and sort of, like, the stuff around how people didn't talk about it, and how, people had a very, like, summer camp sort of narrative about the whole thing, or at least, like, a lot of people did, or my family did. And, I identified too, like, some of those books talked about how, like, trauma showed up in terms of, like, addiction, and in terms of, like, like family violence and things like that happened as a result, and how that was connected to, like, anger about the internment. So yeah, I think I, like, thought a lot about, like, especially at that point in my life, I think my dad was living back in Canada at that point and had, was like no longer really using drugs, but he had just very recently like been in all of that. So yeah, like I was thinking a lot about how him going through that, like that had come from somewhere, and trying to like understand what he was dealing with. And yeah, I think, like it's interesting how, like I felt really disconnected and like it's weird, like, compared to a lot of other like Nikkei people, I have a lot of connection to sort of my Japanese heritage because my mom is an immigrant from Japan, and so like I grew up bilingual and like I grew up like visiting her family in Japan, and then my dad's family, like like they at least did like pass down a lot of the sort of cultural stuff. Like they grew up, like my grandfather plays taiko and they grew up doing judo, and like there are like Buddhists in my grandmother's family who like go to a Japanese American temple every week, and so like that stuff had been passed down, but like I still felt really disconnected from, I guess, from like a sense of like community around it, because my parents had both sort of like were really isolated from Japanese Canadian or like Japanese American community, and I don't know, like I just yeah, I think that lack of community like made it feel like my identity like as a Japanese American person wasn't really, like I just had no frame of reference for it. It was just like whatever was in my own life.
Sure.
But yeah.
Do you think that's because, why do you think that was this kind of disconnect or not, like being a part of any particular community? Was that from moving or?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely from moving, and from like living in places where there weren't really communities. Because I mean, I think, like it seems like Ottawa and Toronto were probably some of the major resettlement sites in Canada. So like there were communities there, and I think, yeah, it's not clear to me how much my dad's generation, like the Sansei generation, grew up with a community. But like definitely like my grandfather's like generation, like the Nisei generation, like their whole sort of social community was like very Japanese. And it seemed like, yeah, like there was a solid like Nikkei community there. So I think that like really existed in the place that my dad grew up in, but he left, and for whatever reason, like, yeah, that wasn't something that he felt connected to or like wanted to seek out. And so, yeah, and in none of the places that I lived, there wasn't really like, like a Nikkei community in the sense of like post-World War II resettlement. Like there were sometimes like in New Jersey, like there were some like sort of like Shin like Nisei community or like Shin Nikkei communities of like people who had like immigrated more recently, but that's like a really different experience. So yeah, I don't know, like I guess I still wonder about like why my dad left and why, because I feel like that has like really impacted my sense of connection. Like I just wonder what it would have been like to grow up in in like Ottawa or in Toronto, where I would have had a really different like kind of access to like a Japanese, like to a Yonsei community.
And so when you came to Chicago, I mean, how we met was through like Japanese American community programs and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about your experience coming to Chicago and I mean, I imagine you tapped in at some point, so can you describe what that was like?
Yeah, it was really yeah, it was really interesting. I definitely was like seeking something, and I felt a lot of like both really wanting it and also like knowing that I'm like an outsider to this particular like community that has this long history of having resettled here right after World War II, and really having like built, like especially like because of all the sort of exclusion from things like housing or like social services or like certain kinds of resources right after World War II, like yeah, I was really struck by how people had really built their own institutions here, and like that like the JASC was started as like a social service organization for that reason, and that like like there were like Japanese American like sports leagues, and just that like the community had sort of organized itself in this particular way because like they had to, and that like that's sort of the origins of the community here. And so I think like I felt definitely this sense of like oh, like like people who are Yonsei here actually have a sense of connection to like this history, not only on the personal like family level of like, oh, like this is a thing that happened to my grandparents, but on a bigger like community level, which like I had never really experienced that before. And I think too I was struck by like, I don't know, yeah, I think it's just like because I didn't have close Nikkei friends for most of my life, the way that I kind of thought about the internment was sort of like, oh, like it wasn't that big of a deal. Like it's not like these were like death camps, it's not like, and so yeah, like I kind of had just taken on this narrative that it was like that it wasn't that significant, and I think yeah, like it was important for me to like be around other like people who were Yonsei who like did see it as really significant and who did really care about like this history and like had thought a lot about like how it had impacted their families, and yeah, and that was just like, yeah, I mean it felt like I was like gaining some perspective or gaining some piece of like my personal history that I didn't even have access to through my own family, because of how they like talked or didn't talk about it, and yeah, and I think like I've been definitely thinking a lot about how like how quickly like targets change in like white supremacy and in racism in this country, and like I think Japanese Americans are such an interesting example of that because like we went from being like incarcerated in mass during World War II to being like lifted up as like the like sort of token example of upward mobility and like assimilation, and like right, and that has had like really like in terms of like the material reality, it's like yeah, like that has been the experience of a lot of like Japanese Americans, and I think it's just like it's telling like how I don't know, like I think, well, I guess there's a couple things. Like one is that I think that still has like a lot of like sort of like emotional and like spiritual and psychic cost to like the fracturing of like community and identity, and like how like I was actually talking to someone I know recently whose family was resettled to Chicago after World War II, and they grew up in like a really small town, somewhere on the East Coast, but in like a rural small town on the East Coast, and it was like it was specifically because like her grandmother had been sitting in some community meeting in Chicago at some point, and they were basically like, look, like we shouldn't, like we should try to disperse, because if we're all here together, like we're a target. And so that was why like her family ended up in this like tiny town on the East Coast, like completely like isolated from any like Japanese American community. And so yeah, like it's just like interesting to be in this community of like people who like did stay and who like did kind of preserve this community when, you know, so much of the consequence and the impact of World War II was that like, you know, that there used to be these really like strong, thriving Japanese American communities on the West Coast, and they were like really like broken up and like, yeah, like fractured as a result of the war.
And when did you come to Chicago and first start connecting with the Japanese American community here?
It was in 2015. Yeah, I moved here in the summer of 2015, so it was about 2 years ago. And I didn't, yeah, I mean, I went to a couple of things when I first moved here. I think I went to like one of the festivals at the JSC or something, and I felt like both this deep sense of like, whoa, like I really wanted it, like I felt really like moved to be in a space where there was such a strong sense of community around being like Japanese American or like being Nikkei, and at the same time, and like this like intergenerational community, and like, you know, just all the stuff that I had never had. And at the same time, like I felt this deep sense of like these people all like grew up here, you know, like it just, I really felt like an outsider to the community, but like really wanted to have some kind of community around it. But I mean, it was really through, I think, like I started going to some of the events with Next Generation Nikkei, which is like a group of you know, like primarily like Yonsei and like younger generation Nikkei people. And I think, yeah, I was really struck by the work that was being done through the JACL with the Kanja project of like bringing like, you know, young like Japanese Americans to do a pilgrimage to the camps and to like learn some of the history. And it seemed like a lot of community had been built among our generation through doing that kind of work. And then I met also like Kenji there, who works with the JACL, who was helping to organize like some kind of summit for people to talk about like, you know, our relationship as Japanese Americans or like as Asian Americans to kind of like movements for Black lives and how to be in solidarity with like Black Lives Matter. And so I think just like seeing people like making connections to how like knowing our history is like an important part of like identity and community, like as Yonsei, and then like connecting that to the kind of, you know, like what racism looks like now in the US, and like what, you know, what movements we want to be like in support of or aligned with, and like what our like role is in supporting that. I think, yeah, like that was really what, you know, like that felt really important to me, and I wanted to like be in community with people who were thinking about that.
To answer your own that question, what do you think? What do you think is the role of the Japanese American community in some of the current movements and issues that are happening? What do you? We'll start there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a lot about the concept of like moving targets, you know, like that, the way that like the model minority myth and like assimilation has been used and the way that like the fracturing of Japanese American communities and Japanese American identity has been used in order to like basically, it's like people are either assimilated into or rejected from like, you know, like whiteness or like nationhood or citizenship or whatever based on what's like politically convenient at the time. And so I think of like Irish and like Italian immigrant, like, you know, like European immigrant communities that were like really like not seen as white for long periods of time in U.S. history. And it was really like in certain moments, like when there was the threat of like some kind of unified like you know, like working class movement between, I think in like, I know in like New York and probably like other places too, there was like moments when there was a lot of like interracial like working class organizing between these like European immigrant communities and like, you know, Puerto Ricans or like other people of color. And it was in those moments where there was the threat of that like there was a big push to like assimilate and to basically like sort of offer this bribe of like you get to be part of whiteness if you can like turn your backs on, you know, this possibility of solidarity and this possibility of like having unity with people who like you see a common struggle with. And so I think like, yeah, with Japanese Americans too, like, you know, like I think we've seen, and with like Asian Americans more generally, like, you know, with the stuff that we've seen with like Chinese Americans turning out to like rally in support of Peter Liang, who was the police officer, the Chinese American police officer who like murdered Akai Gurley, and seeing like how we kind of have this like fraught position now within like the racial hierarchy in the U.S. I think it's like, you know, we get to like, I think we just like have this opportunity to like make a choice about like when we like talk about our history, it's like a reminder that like whatever we're being offered in exchange for like assimilation, it's like, yeah, like there's real like material survival attached to that. And also like, you know, it's like, I don't know, just that like in the system that we live in, like everything that is like being used in order to like divide people and like get people to invest in like a system that is ultimately like not gonna work for everybody is like a tactic. And so yeah, I think it's important to like for us to talk about like how sorry.
You're fine.
I'm like all the way out here. But yeah, I mean basically just that, yeah, it is important for us to like, you know, like continue speaking up about racism and about all of the ways that like, especially like there's such a narrative now that like, you know, like racism doesn't really exist, or like it doesn't really exist in the same way that it used to, and like it is a lot more like hidden in like institutions and in all of these ways that it like codes itself into things that like aren't as overt but like clearly are about racism, but like it's easy to for it to like represent itself as not being about that. And so yeah, I think it's important for us to like speak up about that and you know, and to not like lose how our history connects us to people, to like everyone who's struggling against that.
Do you think that something like this, like the incarceration experience of Japanese Americans, do you think something like this could happen again with where we're at right now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know, like, I think what's hard about, like, the society that we live in is that it's really adaptive to like how, you know, it's kind of like how Michelle Alexander talks about in The New Jim Crow, how like because of the civil rights movement, like racism has had to kind of like code itself into institutions in ways where it can't be like openly identified. And so like I don't know if it would happen like in quite the same way, but I feel like, yeah, I mean, we're definitely, especially right now, like we're seeing like such a resurgence of like you know, just like people feeling really emboldened to like openly express their like just like their racism and their desire for like a white nation. And I think it was really interesting. I was listening to this interview with on Democracy Now! With this guy who like works for an organization that helps people like disengage from like extreme right-wing groups, like, you know, like neo-Nazis and stuff like that. And he was just talking, and he's a former neo-Nazi. He was a neo-Nazi in the 80s and 90s, and he got out. And he was just talking about how, like, 30 years ago, they basically, like, actually came up with this strategy of, like, look, we're not going to be able to, like, we have all these supporters among, you know, sort of, like, right, like, lots of, like, the average, like, racist white American, but who are going to be, like, too scared to, like, openly join us with our, like, you know, being, like, skinheads and being, like, openly Nazis or whatever, or being aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. And so we should, like, you know, instead of shaving our heads, we should, like, put on suits and, like, you know, go to college, and we should, like, become police officers, and we should join the military, and we should, like, become politicians and run for office. And, like, basically they actually, like, literally came up with a strategy of, like, we should put ourselves in institutions. And he was saying, like, the world that we're living in now, like, this, like, Trump's America or whatever, is, like, literally, like, the realization of that, you know, of that plan that they came up with. And yeah, so I think, like, absolutely, like, there's tons of people in our government and in, like, the police force and in the military and in our institutions that, like, would support something like that happening. And, you know, and there's more and more sort of permission for people to be, like, open about those views. So it does feel like we're heading in the direction of, like, something like that happening. And also, at the same time, I think, you know, obviously there's a lot of people who are going to be in resistance to that. I mean, one thing that really, like, strikes me about World War II, like, Japanese American incarceration, like, when I was walking around this gallery looking at the pictures, is I was like, you know, like, what, like, I mean, yeah, it's a really different historical moment, but just, like, were there, like, nobody that was, like, refusing to drive the buses, or, like, nobody who was, like, blockading the streets, or, like, you know, just, like, it seemed like there were so many opportunities for people to, like, refuse or to disrupt, at least, what was happening. And I just, like, that's, like, one thing that I would definitely, it's, like, now I feel like, you know, people are, like, much more committed, or, like, have more tools around organizing that kind of disruption. And so, yeah, I would hope that, like, there would definitely be, like, lots and lots of resistance to things moving in that direction. But I don't know, yeah, I mean, it's a weird moment that we live in, and it's hard to know, like, where we're headed.
As we wrap up, I do want to kind of backtrack a little bit, because I'm just curious about where, like, how you experienced internment in your education, like, in the ages, you know, where you're learning about World War II. Like, how did that come up in the classroom, in your experience?
I barely remember it. I think it was basically just sort of a footnote. You know, like, I remember it was, like, 3 sentences in the textbook kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't think there was ever, like, a unit on it, or, like, any, like, concerted focus. It was just sort of, like, a side note.
do you remember reacting to that at all, or just kind of like, oh yeah?
You know, honestly, I think I had so deeply internalized this belief that like it was insignificant that it didn't strike me at all that it was a footnote.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can be wrapping up, but is there anything that I might have missed or that you would want to add before we wrap up?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. Thank you so much for recording with us.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.